Well, go ahead and open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 30. We're continuing on as we did last week with God is still being good to David. But before we get there, I want you to put your memory caps on and I have a question for you. Okay, so I just want answers. Who are some of the bad leaders we've seen in 1 Samuel so far? Saul. Okay, why was Saul a bad leader?
He feared the people rather than fearing God.
Yeah, feared the people rather than fearing God. Yep.
Eli.
Eli was a bad leader. Why was Eli a bad leader? He was a priest. It's gone. Thank you, though.
He let his sons, well, he himself did not some good things, but he let his sons basically corrupt the office.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, and not only did he was very, very religious, right? He was very religious, wasn't he? And today we do have people like that too, who say that they say the things they should. Just like Eli, he condemned his sons. They were doing horrible things. He condemned them, but he was clearly getting fat off all of their benefits. They would take the meat and eat it themselves, and the text goes out of its way to point out how large he was, that he was benefiting off that as well. And so he refused to actually do anything about their sin. Saul, like you guys said, he feared the people rather than God, and he also, in the process, he was very strong and decisive, but before he asked God, he would try and make up his mind himself. And then God was just kind of to affirm what he already thought. Not a really good example. Today, there are people who are very religious, lead churches, but refuse to actually do anything and obey God. Like, for example, a lot of churches refuse to follow Matthew 18 and actually deal with sin because it might offend somebody, or it might look bad for them, or maybe their large church can't handle if some people stop coming or stop giving. But how about good? Who's been some good leaders? Samuel. Samuel's a good leader. He called people to repent of their sins. Who else? David! Yeah. David's been a good leader who has feared the Lord. Don't forget Jonathan, right? Does anyone remember what Jonathan did that was good leadership?
Strengthened David's hand in the Lord.
He strengthened David's hand in the Lord. He strengthened his rival's hand because he didn't see him as a rival. He saw him as God's choice. And remember when he went up into battle, he said, God can deliver by many or by few. So let's trust the Lord and let's go to battle. And here we're going to another section which is trying to point out why David should be king. Let's remember, the point of 1 Samuel is basically to say, here's the kind of king that the people need. And 1 Samuel is going to end with us going, it's going to be David. And then 2 Samuel, which is actually the completion of the story, is going to end with us going, oh no, it's not David. We need someone better. But what is clear here is the example that they're trying to lay out is look at what David is doing. He does have some good examples. Let's follow him and then ultimately lead us to the ultimate example, which is David's son, Jesus Christ. But we got to review first, because we are almost to the end of the book. We only have one chapter left after this. And then we'll go to 2 Samuel. So the story keeps going. But last week we saw how the story is out of chronological order, if you recall. And the design of that is to actually show a comparison between Saul and David. So it's not doing temporally, it's thematically trying to say David and Saul aren't that different. They are both in similar, desperate situations. They both had reasons to fear, but Saul tried to force God to give him the answer he wanted by going to the medium at Endor, while David submits and follows God. So we've seen how David's rejection protected him. David's rejection protected him from his own foolish slip-up. If you recall, David got himself in a really bad place, right? Because he stopped believing that God could rescue him from Saul, and he went and served the Philistines. And while there, he pretended to fight for the Philistines and against Israel, even while he was attacking Canaanites instead. And that bluff finally got called because he was called into battle. And so they headed up to Aphek to meet with all the kings of the Philistines. And the kings of the Philistines took one look at David and said, nope, you are not fighting with us. We do not trust you. Which is crazy because Achish, his own king, who he had been serving with for over a year, was like, no, David is my bodyguard. He's my right-hand man. Israelites hate him. He totally fooled this guy for a year, but in 1 minute, the other kings refuse. And so David is sent home in chapter 29. But then we get to chapter 30, where though David is cared for through his slip-ups, now we get to this struggle. All of chapter 30 is David's desperate struggle keeps him from battle. God brings him through this difficult situation because in verses 1 through 6, David's men come home and they find their wives captured and their city burned to the ground. The men freak out, and so verse 6 says, David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him because they were all bitter in soul. They wanted to blame their general, their king. It's David's fault. And yet, the way that verse ends, we talked about so important. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He recalled much like what Saul, or what Jonathan, Saul's son, said to him. He said, don't be afraid. My father will not lay a hand on you. You shall be king. And he strengthened him in the Lord. And now David once again strengthens himself in the Lord, believing God's promises. Because, as we said, it was only when David's strength was failing that God's strength could be shown, that God's strength could take over. And with this surpassing strength from the Lord, David shows the readers, and ultimately us, why he should be king in Saul's place. And I had a professor once tell me about the importance of always trying to find truths about leadership in the Bible. Because we have a thing. We all either are leaders or we have to choose our leaders. Right? We get to choose our leaders. And there have been lots about leadership in this book. And so once more, we're going to see this, the 5 signs David should be followed. The original readers were trying to look at this and say, oh, this is why David and his descendants should be king. This is what a king should be like. But this is also for us saying, what should we look like if we're going to lead? Or what should we look for if we are going to follow? So he walks through these 5 ways, 5 markers that show why David should be the king to be followed. The first one, verses 7 and 8, David seeks God when things are bad. When things get desperately bad, David seeks God. Verse 7 and 8. And David said to Abithar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abithar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. So David goes to Abithar the priest. He goes to Abithar the priest. This is the same Abithar who in chapter 22, if you will recall, fled for his life because Saul killed his father, Ahimelech, and all the other priests, and all the women and children at Nob. He killed everyone. Abithar escapes, and he brings with him the ephod. Now, remember, the ephod is these special robes that the high priest would wear, and it was used for religious ceremonies, and just to set them apart as being special, they had to keep them in certain cleanliness, they had to make them from certain things, all to show devotion to God. And part of it was this chest piece, which had numerous stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And within those would be the Urim and the Thummim were brought in. For example, in Exodus 28, verse 30, says, the breastplate of judgment you shall put the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be on Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. Thus Aaron shall bear judgment of the people of Israel on his heart before the Lord regularly. And within there, they would command in the Old Testament, which we've talked about previously, in the Torah, the Pentateuch, was to use these to decide. And somehow they would throw them and decide if God was saying yes or no. Back in chapter 23, verse 9 through 11, we saw him doing this right when he first came. 23:9. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abithar the priest, "Bring the ephod here." Then David said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down? Will your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will come down." What's interesting about the Urim and the Thummim is every answer that you get is always like a yes or no in response. The text doesn't respond with just yes or no, but these seem to be a simple up or down kind of answer. And we don't know exactly how the Urim and Thummim worked, and that's for a reason. Like, it doesn't record what they did because we're not supposed to copy it. In fact, when you get to Ezra chapter 2, verse 63, you see the governor goes to the people and says, "We can't do this because there is no priest to consult the Urim and Thummim. We can't do this anymore." So even by the time of returning from exile, they stop using this and they start relying upon the prophets. But right now, David is obeying the Torah. He has a difficult decision to make. So he remembers what he learned about Exodus and Deuteronomy, and he calls the high priest to obey. And remember, though, there's something was different, because Saul tried this too. And go back to 1 Samuel 14. 1 Samuel 14, 36. A very similar situation where they're going after enemies. Oh, listen for what's different. Then Saul said, "Let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. Let us not leave a man of them." And they said, "Do whatever seems good to you." But the priest said, "Let us draw near to God here." And Saul inquired of God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel?" But he did not answer him that day. What's different about Saul's asking and inquiring versus David's? Anyone notice?
Seems like he already made up his mind.
Yeah, he'd already made up his mind. He said, "We're going to go do this," and a priest has to go, "Hey, Saul, why don't we check with God first?" And what's the answer that Saul gets? He doesn't get an answer because he wasn't really asking. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. There's a way to ask without actually asking, isn't there? But David really humbly goes before, in his desperation, asking Abithar the priest, "Give me an answer." And in verse 8, David gets an answer back. He gets, "Yes, go, pursue, you will overtake them." Again, two yeses. So yes or no. And you got to imagine, okay, we know how the story ends, but again, picture yourselves in the original place. Picture you as one of David's men. This makes as much sense as Jesus telling Peter to throw the nets in again when they had been fishing all night. Like, well-trained soldiers, they would not be despairing if they knew how to find the people who did this, right? Because men, they get there, there are no bodies, everything's burned. If they knew what to do, they would have chased after them right away. They're like, their tracks right here. Let's go. We can catch up with them. They've only been gone for a few hours. Like, it's still burning. No, they're desperate because they couldn't do anything. So God says, pursue. They're like, oh, okay. How? Where? What do we do? And David, in his wisdom, takes off, trying to obey God, trying to take back his family. God promises rescue, and so they know they will save the people. See, a good leader always seeks God and then acts on what God says. James Donnie, an old dead guy, wrote, "It is natural for us to trust in ourselves. It is so natural and so confirmed by the habits of lifetime that no ordinary difficulties or perplexities avail to break us of it. It takes all God can do to root up our self-confidence. He must reduce us to despair. He must bring us to such an extremity that one voice we have in our hearts, that one voice that cries to us wherever we look round for help, is death, death, death. It is out of this despair that the superhuman hope is born. It is out of this abject helplessness that the soul learns to look up with new trust to God." David knew this, that any good leader must know they are not sufficient and they need God because they've learned the lesson of despair. And the first difference between the good king and the bad king we see is the good king goes to God for an answer rather than just to confirm what he already wants, right? And in the same way, we need to watch how our leaders pray, right? Like that's so, it seems so obvious, and yet it's a really important question. Because a good church leader knows, as 1 Peter 5:4 says, they are merely under-shepherds to the chief shepherd, Jesus Christ. Good church leaders know they need to pray and ask the Lord for help because they can't do it on their own. And maybe some people here want to be a leader. 1 Timothy 3:1 says, "The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble work." And part of that work is deep, desperate prayer. Whether it's as a parent or a teacher or a discipler or a pastor or being a president of the United States, we all need to be praying for wisdom. And while we might not get a yes or no answer from a priest like David does, we know that the prayers of a righteous man accomplish much. And so, prayer is key. David wisely prays, and then in the midst of this bad situation, we find that David is kind, even when stressed. David prays, he goes to action. Verses 9 through 15, in obedience, David, verse 9, sets out, and the 600 men who are with him, and they came to the brook of Beshor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 men stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Beshor. David sets out with his 600 men, the same 600 men that David has had for a long time now. Back in 1 Samuel 23, verse 13, David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah. So basically, as long as Abithar's been around, it's been these 600 men. 1 Samuel 27, verse 2, David arose and went over, he and his 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Makoach, king of Gath. So David's not really growing in size. He's not having this super successful, seeker-sensitive ministry where people keep flocking to him. He got his 600, and it's still 600. Interestingly, another comparison with Saul, that in 1 Samuel 13, when Saul goes into a desperate situation where only 2 swords exist in his hand and in the hand of his son Jonathan, he also has 600 men. The parallels are being shown. But the men rush to the brook Beshor, or as the Jewish people say, Wadi Beshor, because Wadi just sounds like a cooler word, so I have to say that. Today it's called Wadi Gahaz, Gahazis, let me get this right, Gazazi.
How do you pronounce that?
Beshor or Gazi?
Yeah, no.
Gazi. Yeah, I think that's how you say it. It's funny. It's modern Israeli. It flows, you can kind of see up there, a little line in the middle. It flows into, it's that second arrow, it flows into the Mediterranean Sea, and they run there. And guess what happens? What phrase repeats over and over here? He says, those who were left behind stayed, but David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 men stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Beshor. Did you see that they said twice, stayed behind, left behind? Hint when you're reading your Bible. If they repeat something, stop and go, why are they repeating that? Because it's usually important. They do it for the sake of emphasis. This repetition is reminding us that it's going to be what happens into verse 25. This is going to set up a rule from Israel from that day forward to this day. Because in verse 10, 400 continue, 200 stay behind, because these men are in a state of physical fatigue. The word for fatigue there, or for exhausted, also has the connotation of being a statue or a moving or a corpse. So it's not that these men are just lazy or tired. Because what's happened to their families? They're kidnapped. Their families are, and if there's one thing you want to do to get a man on fire is hurt his family, right? Mess with my family, I'm going to have a little bit of hard time with self-control. It's just what happens. Dolly's perfect. If you want to fire me up, you threaten my family. These men are like that, but they are exhausted because remember, they, even though they're here at Beshor, have been traveling all the way from. They traveled all the way from where they gathered in there, went to Gath, went up to Aphek, and then they got rejected, and they spent 3 days to come back down. 3 days to come back to their hometown. They found it deserted, and then they took off running again here till they got to Beshor, and they are just dead. 3 days from Ziklag, off running. They could not continue. David has only 400 men. He graciously allows his men to stay behind, and they proceed across the cavern, through the water, and are looking until they find an Egyptian in an open field. Verse 11. They found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong? And where are you from?" He said, "I am a young man of Egypt, servant to Amalekites, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. He made a raid against the Negev of the Cherethites, against which belongs to Judah, and against the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." And David said to him, "Will you take me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band." No indication in the text that he is known to be connected with David's quests. Right? It just says they found an Egyptian in open country. In the middle of a field, they found a man. Maybe he had something to do with their lost families. Maybe not. They don't know. But the man is near death. And he cannot speak anything. And so they give him bread and water, the essentials of life. In verse 12, they give him fig cakes, just like the ones Abigail gave them, which is kind of like a sugary substance. So you all know how, okay, bread and water might feed your stomach, but when you have something sweet, it kind of sharpens your eyes. Yeah, it gets you, it revives you a little bit. And David's kindness literally is translated, it turned his spirit around. So he went from near death to life. And so in verse 13, David asks him, "Who are you?" And begins a series of dialogue as they go back and forth. Right? The servant responds, that basically confirms everything God says about the Amalekites. You gotta remember, Amalekites were the people who God said, destroy them all because they are a wicked people. We talked about how it was ethical killing, not ethnic killing. It wasn't that God was trying to wipe out a people, it's because they were evil, and this proves that. Because the servant responds, they left me. Though the people had plenty of war spoils. And as we'll see in a minute, they had camels. But they inhumanely left their slave to die in the wilderness when he got sick. Sick means ill or faint. It could just mean really tired, or it could mean some type of disease. The fact that he recovered probably indicates he was more just exhausted, like deathly exhausted, than necessarily with some type of sickness. But think about it this way. This is a comparison. When David had 200 men who he was going to rescue his family, when they were going, and they got to the water and they got tired, how did he respond? He let them rest. And we see them, and he left them with baggage and supplies that they would be okay. The Amalekites, when they had one man who got too tired to continue, too sick to continue, what do they do with him? They leave him for dead. These people are wicked, abandoning one of their own. Unrighteous people do this. Proverbs 12, verse 10 says, whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Proverbs 12:10. You get like that. The righteous person, we even care for our animals. We're not going to be horrible to animals just because. But a wicked person, even their mercy is cruel. So he explains what happens. He explains what they've been doing, and then it comes out at the end of verse 14. We burn Ziklag with fire. And we realize this man is one of the very group that David has been looking for. They had stripped the land of the Cheathites, who are members of a tribal group that was nearby. They had attacked Judah. They had attacked Caleb. And they had burned Ziklag. Notice he uses, does he use the word they? They burned it? No, he says we. And so he was part of it. He fought with them. And so verse 14 kind of almost leaves us with a question. What is David going to do to one of the men who destroyed his city and captured his family? How will David respond? But David's response, in verse 15, is to ask for help. He says, will you take me down to this band? Take me to the troops. And the man's response is, yes, on two conditions. Don't kill me, David, and don't give me back to my master. David must have agreed, because they depart and they go and find the Amalekites. It is kind of crazy to think about just the way this worked, because David is in a huge hurry. He has a problem to solve, and he rescues a man who he has no idea if he's going to actually gain a benefit yet. He feeds the man on the hope that maybe some good news would come through. But and this reflects on something, even in the midst of busyness or worry, a good leader must be willing to show kindness to others. It was part of Jesus' point in the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? In Luke 10, you had the priest and the Levite who were too busy or too worried about becoming unclean to touch this man and help him. But, verse 33, a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was. When he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. Jesus answered, you must go do likewise. So I think leaders want to be productive people. We have people to serve. We have things to get done. We have projects to accomplish. We have sermons to prepare. We have services to accomplish. And one thing that's often asked is, what is the best use of our time? And Paul writes in Ephesians 5, verse 15, look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of your time, because the days of evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of God is. And we know, of course, the will of God, according to the great commandment in Matthew 22, is to love God and love others. So again, the most productive thing someone can do in God's eyes, the most time-efficient thing, is loving other people. And I'll be honest, the specifics sometimes get a little bit cloudy. It's a little hard, like what is the most loving thing to do? And they require prayer for wisdom. But the goal always has to be loving other people. And someone who is worthy of being your leader, like David is worthy of being the king of Israel, they don't just get things done. They love people, even their enemies. And when David loves this enemy, who he doesn't even know for sure is an enemy yet, he finds himself having the exact path given to him. Remember, the people left out, trusting God, they would find him. They would find these people, find the ones who took their family. They took off running, not knowing the way to go, just having a general path. Some of them get tired, their numbers decrease, and they happen upon a man who can take them exactly where they need to go. David asked for God's wisdom. Then David's choice to stop and love this man produced his victory, because David sees God's promises fulfilled. Verses 16 through 20. When he, the Egyptian, had taken him, David, down, behold, they were spread abroad all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because all of the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening on the next day, and not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. David recovered all the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, "This is David's spoil." God's promises come through. The description of the Amalekites continues, of how just against Yahweh they are, their evilness. They are spread out, meaning it's like they're uncultivated. They're all over the place. They're eating, feasting. They're drinking, getting intoxicated. They're dancing, which literally means to celebrate in a festival, a religious festival. So here they are celebrating the achievement of their gods, that they were able to take all these spoils from other people. And the reason is given. They had taken from the Philistines and from Judah. They were enemies of both. They weren't really against God or against anyone. They were just stealing from anyone that they could. And so, in verse 17, David enters the battle. He struck them down. I like the King James Version. He smited them. He smote them. Some translations might work out. And the best translation of it is basically he attacked them from twilight, which is right after sunset, like right when it gets dark, until evening, right before the sun sets the next day. So it's almost 24 hours of battle, going around and killing all of the wicked Amalekites so that only 400 men escape on their camels, which David's men on foot couldn't chase. Verse 18 shows David saved his family and everything all his men had. The blessings of God are shown Unlike Saul, who received curses, David obeyed God and is receiving the covenant blessings. Remember back in the Mosaic Law, we talked about this, how there was blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. Reading this, they'd be like, oh, David's getting those blessings. He's defeating his enemies. And every one of his men know, end of verse 20, this is David's spoil. See, David heard God give him a promise in verse 8. He was going to overtake them. He was going to rescue them. And he trusted God. And every Christian leader should trust God's promises and therefore obey his commands. As Christians, we don't actually have a promise that everything's going to go good like this. David, while his home was destroyed, everything precious to him was fine, right? Like, who cares if that building burns down as long as my family is safe? But John 16:33, Jesus says, I said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. But take heart, I have overcome the world. When Jesus says you will have tribulation, that's a promise, right? Is that a promise of comfort and ease? Nope. But our hope is Jesus says, I have overcome the world. Jesus has won. And so he tells us in Galatians 6:9, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. A leader who you should follow is one who must not give up, is one who fights to follow God, waiting for him to give the good fruit of his labor. It might be tomorrow. It might be 20 years. It might not be this side of heaven. But he knows God will bless. In the same way, that's our motivation for continuing on and following that path. Is you go, I don't see it working out right away, but I trust God's promise. Because the same God who rescued David is my God today. He will do good. But though David's work against his enemies is done, he's rescued his family, he's rescued the families of his men, he has received great plunder, but now he has to work against his own people. Because again, Saul's big problem wasn't fearing his enemies, it was fearing his friends. Now David has the same opportunity, because we'll see David is gracious because God has been good to him. Verse 21 through 25. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David and who had been left at the brook Beshor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart. But David said, you shall not do so, my brothers. With what the Lord has given us, he has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the luggage. They shall share alike. And he made a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. David understands he needs to be gracious because God has been gracious to him. The men head back to Beshor. They come upon the valley again. They meet the 200 who were too exhausted to continue, and who we find out actually had all the supplies with them. So they weren't just sitting around doing nothing. They were watching the supplies, keeping them safe, and recovering. And everyone's happy to see each other again. There's rejoicing. You could just imagine, picture the scene. Like the wives and the children of those men now see their fathers. The fathers see their children. There's hugging. They see David. And then in verse 22, the wicked and worthless open their mouths. Now, we already knew David's group was kind of a rough gang. These are not the elite and fine religious folk. 1 Samuel 22, verse 2 said, everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became commander over them. Again, does that sound like a great group of people who you want to lead around? No, they're the ones who are upset already. But now we see how bad some of them really are, because they use the excuse of justice and fairness to hide their greed. They propose these 200 laggards who were lazy men, they can take their wives and their children, and they can just shove off. But they're not going to get their hands on any of the plunder that we worked hard on because they were so lazy to stay behind. It almost makes sense, right? Like, they did the work, they deserve the spoils. Do you ever feel that way? You're like, this isn't fair. Like, I'm the one doing it all. Why is someone else getting praise? Why is someone else getting this or that? David's response in 4 parts is brilliant. He starts off with warmth. He says, verse 23, you shall not do so, my brothers. He lovingly appeals to them, even though he is their king, their leader, the one whose all the spoil belongs to, because it's David's spoil. He appeals to them as brothers. And he makes then an argument, a theological argument, saying, with what Yahweh has given us, he has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. The theology comes out, right? He's using the theology card. This was a gift from God, people. Like, do you realize how incredible it was that we even found these men, let alone we fought them, having been exhausted for almost 24 hours, and we won? Like, clearly, this was God's battle. How can we say that they don't deserve it when we don't deserve this? You understand his argument? Like, this was grace. Then he says, okay, but skepticism comes out. Who's going to listen to you? Who would listen to you in this matter? This doesn't make sense. This is foolishness. This is your pride speaking, man. And he ends it with the authority of the king, stating, for as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. Everyone who helps in some way is going to receive the same share. And this becomes the standard for Israel going forward. See, a good leader helps you think about others. And he's going to hate me for saying this, but Pastor Yuri is really great at this. Yeah, like, just some of you have had this experience where you complained about someone else. Let's just all be honest here. Okay, all of us have at some point complained about someone else in the church because we're sinners, and a number of us have done that to Pastor Yuri. And he does such a great job of helping us think, well, one, okay, remember how good God has been to you. Remember God, God's grace and mercy to you, but also think of it from their point of view, what they've had to go through. Be patient and kind to that person. And you walk away going, yeah, okay. I don't like it, but you're right. And then slowly we're like, okay, yeah, no, he was right. That was a good thing. Okay. All right. Let's just see that. Because Christians, I know this is crazy, we're supposed to share. It's not just teaching my little preschoolers to share. Christians are supposed to share. Because we don't want to be like the worthless men who wanted justice but refused mercy and grace, right? Hold your finger here and go to 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Because the Corinthians were dealing with this problem. They were all up, kind of mocking one another. They were looking at each other's gifts and saying how much better one's gifts were than the other. And Paul, gently but strongly, says in chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, 1 Corinthians 4, 6 and 7, I have applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, brothers, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written. For none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against another. For who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? If then you received it, why do you boast as if you didn't receive it? He tells them and says, God has given you everything. God is giving you every gift you have. Why are you boasting as if it's yours? And then he goes on in chapter 12, still 1 Corinthians, chapter 12, verse 25. Say, okay, so what are you supposed to do with these gifts? We have different gifts. Some of them are more obvious than others. Some of us have upfront gifts. Some of us don't. And he says, verse 25 and 26, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may each have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. I think sometimes, especially as Christians who are excited about doing God's work and excited about using our gifts, sometimes we look at someone else who's actually accomplishing something. Maybe it's in another church. Maybe it's not our church. Maybe it's another church. You hear something amazing going on. And it's like this frustration of, why is this person, this church, getting the credit? And Paul's admonishment and encouragement to us would be to say, they are part of your body. Your left hand doesn't get upset that your right hand is dominant and holds a pen more often, because it's all you. In the same way, we rejoice over the benefits towards any other Christian. And when any Christian suffers, we suffer. None of us is better, and some of us are out of the battle, left holding the bag. We're praying from behind. We're not the ones really accomplishing anything. And yet, we are equal sharers in the power of God and the benefit of the body. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, and share. David convinces his men, and the passage ends with him also convincing Judah. Go back to 1 Samuel 30. Not only does David get his men convinced, we see David is wise to build his kingdom alongside others. He doesn't just go about it himself, but instead, verse 26, chapter 30, when David came to Ziklag, he sent part of his spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. It was for those in Bethel, in Ramoth of Negev, in Jatir, in Aoer, in Shipmoth, in Eshtemiah, in Rakal, in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, in the cities of the Kenites, in Hormah, in Bor Asham, in Atak, in Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. David goes to the elders of Judah, having returned, and brings the spoils to them as well. Because remember, verse 15 and 16 had said that the Amalekites had taken them not just from the Philistines, but also from Judah. So they've been stealing from Judah. So David restores some of the bounty to them, but also says, hey, in all the places where my men have roamed, here's payment. Here's remembrance. Here's thank you gifts. David asks them to spread it out. He doesn't spread it out himself. He gets them on board, both with his gifts and with his thanking of all the other people. And then go to 2 Samuel 2, verse 24. And the men of Judah came And there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Where was David first crowned king? Was it all of Israel? Nope. It was king over the what? The house of who? Judah. 2 Samuel 2, verse 4. David's clever strategy here of giving gifts to the Judites means that he then is first one to receive them. He returned, then he'll end up coming back to Hebron and making that his capital, and he becomes king there. So, overall, we've seen David should be the leader of Israel. Why? Not because he's the best, because he's in this problem because he messed up and didn't trust God. Nor because he always has it easy, there are no problems, but because he trusts God in hard times. And this is our call as Christians, even today. We have to be leaders who trust God, and we have to seek wisdom from God, and we have to follow those leaders who do. Let me pray for us. Oh Lord, grant us the wisdom that we need to lead and to follow to the glory of your name. We know we are not better than David, and we will mess up. But Lord, in our mistakes, may you be gracious. In our sin, may you be faithful. And Lord, may you use those things to grow us. So grow us, Lord, into a church of leaders who serve you, and into those who follow to serve you. Again, praise of your name. Amen.